So the other point of origin for the character of Max was a project that I did in 2010 here with Mimi Tessier. And we interviewed women who had flown planes in the Air Transport Auxiliary. The Air Transport Auxiliary, if you don't know, was a civilian group of women who flew planes to where the RAF needed them in Britain, so they didn't have to use their pilots to fly them from one base to another if they needed them in a different place. It was a very odd organization. It was mostly, at least initially, formed of very posh women because they knew how to fly. The ads later, one of the pilots we interviewed said there was an ad in a flying magazine that she had because her boyfriend liked flying, and they wanted people who could ski or play lacrosse or something. Basically, they needed people with eye-hand coordination, but they wanted a certain type of people with eye-hand coordination. And she said, we knew how to play tennis, so they took us. But they had a terrible time. They would fly in unheated planes, and for the first several years, they required them to wear skirts. It was only after a lot of campaigning they were able to wear trousers, but they had to change back into skirts as soon as they landed because it wasn't proper for them to be in trousers. They also flew through Britain with no radio communications. They weren't allowed to use any communications at all, so they were incredibly brave to do the things they did. But I wanted somebody who had an unusual war service record, and also wanted her to be able to fly, because that becomes a plot point later. So I'm going to jump ahead quite a bit to the reason the novel is called Cold Crash is because her plane crashes. So I'm going to read the part where her plane crashes. I'm cutting out a bit of this scene just because it won't make sense if you haven't read the rest of the novel yet. So Max is flying. Max took off from the field and turned the plane west. The blue sky of yesterday morning had congealed into lumps of solid gray clouds. Survey would be easier with Victor beside her to examine the ground as she flew, but Max saw the evidence under the cover of grass for prehistoric circles and a few military installations from the war, now succumbing to creeping growth. Fog started to seep in from the sea. She should maneuver towards the field and head back to the pub. She stretched her cold fingers. Suddenly, the controls juddered beneath her hands. The engine moaned and then fell silent. The plane jerked, and she did her best to level it. The fog grew thicker, and Max breathed deep to ignore the metallic fear in her mouth. The plane plummeted. Max switched the fuel tanks and hit the boost pump, struggling to keep the plane from stalling. The fog. She remembered Peter drawing how to land a plane blind on that napkin in a club, but theory didn't add up when the engine failed to respond. Please, God, let her be above one of those nice wide fields and not... She dropped below the fog and saw 2 trees and a building in the near distance. She wrenched the controls and the plane bounced twice, hard, before skidding into a spin, a wave of mud cascading over the cockpit. Stillness. Max took 6 deep breaths and finally looked out the side window. Clear of the building, pretty damn close to one of the trees. Thunder rolled again, but this time lightning split the sky. Max mumbled a prayer and pried her fingers loose from the controls. She flicked the switches on the silent engine. A jagged hole pierced the roof of the barn, so she doubted she'd find any help there. Fog, normal. Thunderstorms, normal. Neither ideal, but she'd flown in them before. Her engine had never failed like that. Never. Max unhooked her seatbelt and pressed the heels of her hand to her eyes. Had George's planes plummeted like that? Had he found a clear field? She allowed herself 6 more deep breaths. She had to focus on the present. Her repair skills stayed pretty basic, but she could at least assess the damage. Thunder crashed and rain pelted against the plane. The treetops pitched from side to side in the wind and heavy rain. She would have had to set down anyway, and the cockpit kept her dry. She could sit out the storm before inspecting the engine. Max crawled back into the front seat with a book. The rain plummeted against the metal of the plane. 2 hours later, it had not abated. 3 hours later, the rain continued. Max flexed her feet. Could she spend the night in here? She had the full equivalent of a meal in her bag, plus some of the American tins and chocolate. Her ration book lay in the bag, so it couldn't be stolen again. Eventually, the rain should stop. Getting wet wouldn't be a disaster, but nothing about the Fentimans, Adam and Jane's squeaking bed, or the lumps and dips in her own appealed. The plane held both a hip flask of whiskey and a canteen of water. Darkness fell, and Max used her torch to keep reading. She opened the tin and nibbled. When the torch died, she'd sleep. It would be fine. The plane would be secure. 2 hours later, lights bobbed in the distance. Max extinguished her torch. A search party hadn't occurred to her. Would the Fentimans worry, or even know where to look for her? What if Mrs. Fentiman had rung her parents? 3 lights flickered and shifted, but none came towards her field. They converged behind her. Max twisted in her seat and went towards the coast. The reflections shot across the water, not randomly this time, but in sequence. They diffused too much in the rain for Max to distinguish the order, but an answering flash clearly came from too far westwards to be anything but at sea. The lights turned back towards the land, and this time they cast wide, sweeping searches. They would hit the plane. They would hit the plane and come over to investigate. What would she say? Max tightened her boots, shoved her notebook inside her jacket, and as quietly as she had ever managed it in her life, unlatched the plane's door. They had gone quite a distance westward. Maybe she had time. She leaned out. The wind blasted and rain lashed her face. She could have opened the door normally. Max jumped down into the mud. Something warm brushed her, and she nearly screamed before the smell of manure told her it was a cow. Max pushed it out of the way and scurried away as the light drew near her. They caught the silver of the plane high up, and Max shied away from the bright circle. Even through the wind, she heard the shout. She started running, letting the wind push her away faster. Not the building, they'd go there first. She would have, if it hadn't been for the downpours. Not to the sea, where the other light hid in the blackness. Max ran northwest, circling above the plane and kept going. 8 trees away, she stopped and hid as the lights closed in on her plane. Through the wind, they had to shout, so only snatches reached her. Landed anyway. The smack of the cockpit door sounded as loud as the hand had last night. Not here. More followed that she couldn't hear, but she kept running in the opposite direction. Landed anyway thudded in her head in time with her feet. Did that mean that her plane had been tampered with, that the engine? She twisted to look over her shoulder and fell heavily. Light swooshed over her head. 3 bodies stood near her plane, rotating their torches around. Max stayed perfectly still as one patch approached her, closer and closer. She's gone. Wouldn't have seen anything anyway. The bodies followed the lights away, past the building. Max remained in place for 5 more minutes before cautiously standing. She expected someone to shout and grab her, but nothing happened. She wiped the mud from her face. Dare she go back to the plane? What if they left the door open in the rain? 3 of the books were library books. Max closed her eyes. She could not fret about that now. The notebook pressed into her side. Did this qualify as something? More slowly now, she walked north. For the first time, the cold wind registered with her. The rain and mud saturated her clothes, and her boots started leaking. The map had indicated a road that way, into Tobermory, the town she should have considered stopping in that first night, if only she had. 40 minutes later, she heard the press of boots against the ground. Lots of boots. More than 3 men, and torches didn't accompany these feet. Max ducked behind a tree and stayed still. The rain had ceased, although the trees still bent in the wind. Thank you very much. The other thing is I don't fly. I barely fly in commercial airplanes. But as it turns out, there's a large number of people who are very devoted to antique planes, flying them, talking about them, all on YouTube. You can have close-up videos of the plane that I gave Max, taking off, landing, lots of things about what happens when they go wrong, and they seem to go wrong an awful lot. So it's actually quite easy to research planes, I've learned. Because one of the things I wanted Max to be was to be a very strong female character, but I didn't want her to have kind of the tropes that female characters who are strong often get burdened with. I didn't want her to be an alcoholic, although she does drink quite a lot, but I didn't want her to be a functioning alcoholic. I didn't want her to have a great broken-hearted story. I wanted the challenges that she faced to be external to her. So she goes to Scotland, she's planning on doing field work, and she stumbles into something she didn't think she was going to encounter, and that's how she copes with it was of interest to me. One of the things that I changed quite a lot with the book, I started the book knowing that it was going to end on a train. I wrote one of the first things I wrote was the final scene, was a conversation on a train. But then after I wrote the whole book and it ended on the train, and the competition that I entered, it won ending on the train, I started thinking that one of the things I think action and thriller films don't often do is go into how characters deal with the aftermath of the horrible things they've seen and encountered. And I was really interested in how a normal person goes back to normal life after having something traumatic happen. So the novel is now nearly 20,000 words longer because I put in what happens next. This is partly because I'm writing, it's part of a 4-book series. It takes place over a calendar year in Max's life. But I wanted to see what happened when she came home, how you go back into normal family life after having something terrible happen to you. The other thing that's quite useful about writing a 4-book series is I've finished the second one now, but I was writing the second one while I was editing the first. And I'm writing the third one now as I'm editing the second. And the benefit of doing that, of having a longer narrative and getting to know a character better, is there were a lot of changes that I put into the first novel after I thought it was finished because I needed it. So there's a character who's in this book a fair bit, whose name is Charlie. He's her cousin. And the only reason he's in this book at all, he wasn't initially in this book at all, is because he's quite an important character in the second book. And the reason, at the end of the novel, this affects the plot in no way, shape, or form. He's broken his leg. The only reason he's broken his leg is because I still think very much in an American way. And the second book takes place in the summer, and I thought, oh, he'll be there, he'll be out of school. And then I looked at the British school year, and I thought, he's not out of school. So in order to allow him to be there in June, he's broken his leg. So it's fitting the pieces together.